Have you ever felt like you just can't catch a break? No matter how hard you work, you just can't even imagine owning your own home or even moving out of your parents' house. Have you ever wondered why our parents could afford a house with 3 or 4 years worth of salary, while nowadays it's at least 10 years worth of salary, of a good salary, to be able to afford a 3-bedroom, 2 or 3 bedroom house? Well, you're completely not alone. In today's video, I'm going to explain exactly how and why our generation is financially fucked, and if it's going to get better, if it's going to get worse, and finally how to best position yourself to take advantage of the major shifts that are going to be coming to society over the coming decades. So if you feel like your wage hasn't really been keeping up with inflation, or the amount that you earn barely is enough for your basic necessities like your rent or your mortgage or kids if you have kids, well, that feeling is actually 100% justified. I'm going to show you a few charts which show that at the moment our generation is much poorer than previous generations were at our age. So at the moment, the boomer generation have a disproportionately massive portion of the global wealth. So this chart probably shows it the best. So people who are age 75 over the last 30 years, since 1989 to 2016, their wealth has increased by 100%. So people who are 79 right now are twice as wealthy as people who were 79 in 1989, while people who are in 35 to 44 now are half as wealthy as people who were 35 to 44 in 1990. Here's another chart just showing how the baby boomers' wealth has grown massively since they were 40 to now that they're age 60 or more. Similarly, you can see millennials' wealth has barely done anything. Gen Xers have had a bit of an increase. Okay, so despite millennials earning the most money right now and working the most out of any other generation, so they're earning the most and they're working the most, they only have 5% of the wealth. Whereas, and taking into account that all these generations roughly have the same population. So millennials have 5% of the wealth. Baby boomers also make up about 25% of the population, but they have 60% of the wealth. Alright, so maybe now you kind of start to believe me that our generation is disproportionately poor compared to other previous generations, and you might be kind of angry at previous generations, but let's just explain why this has happened. And it's not their fault, it's not the baby boomers' fault, it's a variety of factors, but the first factor being demographics. So basically, boomers were born just after World War II, and they are a huge population. There was huge population growth after World War II. Everyone was just like rabbits, you know what I mean? Everyone was reproducing like crazy. So the population went up 40% within 20 years. So the population of the United States increased by 40% in 20 years. So that was population growth like there's never been before. So people who are born after World War II, most of them are still working now. So us millennials coming up, who are their kids, they're still working, and now we have to compete with them for their jobs. So that's one of the first factors we'll talk about. Or the baby boomers experience GDP growth like never before on Earth. So there was this massive increase in population, and as we'll get into, people are extrapolating this population growth out into the future, but as we'll see, that is not what's going to happen whatsoever. But we'll save that till later on in the video. But with this massive increase in population, there was a massive increase in GDP, and boomers really benefited a lot from this massive increase in GDP. The second reason for the boomers having all the wealth right now is one you might have realized already. It was the break from the gold standard in 1972. So in 1972, the United States broke away from the gold standard. Just as a side tangent, this was because France said to Richard Nixon, the president, "Oh, we want to get our gold back. We think you're printing more dollars than you have in gold reserves," which they were. So the French wanted to get their gold back, and the US could not afford to give them back the gold. So they broke away from the gold standard and gave them dollars instead. So once they broke away from the gold standard, they could print money because they didn't have to make it redeemable for gold. So there was nothing backing fiat money anymore. So there was just an incentive to print endlessly for governments, so they could extract more of the wealth from the population. They could tax without having to tax, essentially. So every government does this. If they're not backed by gold, every government will end up doing this. Basically, when they do this, this leads to a massive increase in asset prices. So the baby boomers at that time in 1972, they were buying their houses, they were investing in stock market, they were buying gold, and everything from there just went to the moon. And now we know that buying a house is very expensive. Stocks are very expensive. Gold is very expensive in comparison to what it was in 1970s. So that's the two main reasons why boomers have become so disproportionately wealthy compared to us younger generations. And another reason why us younger generations, why our wages haven't gone up so much, is because, as I mentioned, we're competing with our parents for jobs. So that's a huge population. We're also quite a large population. Additionally, women joined the workforce. So we basically doubled the workforce over the last 50 odd years, which is obviously great. And finally, we also went to a completely globalist regime where there was very low taxes between countries. So instead of manufacturing in first world countries, manufacturing all went to third world countries, which was great for third world countries. It gave them a lot of prosperity and growth. But this massive increase in workers from the 1950s to today, so when the supply of jobs stays the same, but the demand for jobs goes through the roof because we've doubled the demand for jobs because women joined the workforce, and also two massive populations are competing with each other for jobs. So the only thing that can happen is that wages don't really grow at all, and that's what's happened for the last 30 years. You can see in this chart productivity, so basically GDP, has gone up since 1950. 246% GDP has gone up, but in 1972, once we broke away from the gold standard, we can see that compensation or wages haven't gone anywhere in the last 40 years in real terms. This is in real terms. So it's a combined factor of fiat money and demographics, which has led to this massive discrepancy in wages for millennials and wealth for millennials in comparisons to other generations. So we've talked about fiat debasement and demographics in relation to discrepancy between wealth populations or populations' wealth. Another point was that this huge generation of baby boomers, this huge population of baby boomers, were all promised really good pensions because they were earning so much, and governments and companies extrapolated out into the future saying there's going to be plenty of young people to support all these old people, but actually our populations are the same, or even their population is actually bigger than ours. So this is an unhealthy population pyramid. Pretty much every first world country looks like this. So there's much less young people trying to support much more old people. So like I mentioned in previous videos, there's trillions in unfunded liabilities. So basically like pensions, healthcare promises. So like if you get sick, don't worry about it, we'll look after you. Don't worry about it when you get old, we'll look after you in your pension. And this was all kind of resting on the hope, well not the hope, but they assumed that population would continually grow forever, which it usually does. But now we're starting to flatline population growth in first world countries. Like most first world countries are actually in population decline. And not only that, people are living much, much longer. So the amount of time that they stay in retirement and in hospitals is much longer. So there's a lot more liabilities that the government has promised, and not as many millennials to pay the taxes to make up for that. So how can we take advantage? Well, not take advantage, but how can we position ourselves for this big problem? So the government has a few different options on how they can tackle this major problem, how they can pay off their future debts, and how they can fund their future liabilities, because their future liabilities are enormous. Okay, option 1, wealth redistribution. So tax the rich more, give it to the poor, give it to the elderly, etc., fund healthcare. Option 2, lower interest rates, hoping to boost up the economy, make the economy grow faster, and in that way be able to pay off your debts easier and also get more revenue in taxes. Option 3 is fiscal stimulus, so they can go into a deficit, spend all this money by just taking on massive amounts of debt. Okay, so if you noticed anything about those options, most of them lead to monetary debasement. So Lowering interest rates means more credit is created, which means monetary debasement, as in more money will be created. Fiscal stimulus also will lead to monetary debasement, and as we know, monetary debasement over time leads to asset prices going up. And the other option, by taxing the rich really egregiously, putting massive taxes on the rich. What are the rich going to do in that circumstance? If they're getting really highly taxed, what's your incentive? Your incentive is to take out more debt instead of earning a lot of income, instead of selling your assets. And the other incentive is, if it gets really bad, is to put your wealth into something that's extremely hard to seize, very easy to take anywhere with you in the world, and move to a jurisdiction where you're more favorably taxed. So as you can see from pretty much all those options, which I assume they're going to probably do a mix of all of those options, the governments are, to be able to fund these liabilities over the coming decades. But what was created in response to massive monetary debasement? Of course, you've probably guessed it by now, our good little friend right here. So as we know, we're in a high inflation environment, and that inflation could continue for the coming decades. So getting an average of 5 to 10% per year, which is fine if you're already rich. If you're a boomer who has a lot of houses, that's fine. If you just make your standard 5 or 10%, you're kind of hopefully keeping up with inflation. But if you're not, you need to try harder. So what are the different options that you could take advantage of this massive shift that's going to be coming over the next 10 to 20 years? So over the next 20 years, $69 trillion will pass from the baby boomers to the millennials and below. And it's actually 68 trillion, but I changed it for obvious reasons. So there's $69 trillion being passed down, and most of this, as we said, this was bought 30 years ago. So this is stocks and real estate. So most of the baby boomers' wealth is tied up in stocks, bonds and real estate. And the stocks and bonds, mostly their pensions. So is real estate a good investment over the next 20 years? But as we can see, millennials have a lower percentage of home ownership than previous generations did at those same ages. And it's just perfectly, like, each generation has lower home ownership as those effects made buying a home much more difficult for the younger generations. So most of the real estate is owned by the baby boomers, and we can see in pretty much every first world country that the population is in decline. So there's going to be a massive supply of real estate over the next 20 years, and if the population is no longer growing and is also in decline in most of these first world countries, where's the demand going to come from for all these homes? In my opinion, over the long term, maybe real estate isn't the best play. So in my opinion, crypto and disruptive companies could be a better option. So obviously this is a very long term oriented video. This is decades out, but investing in crypto and disruptive stocks during a recession, like, you're probably going to massively outperform the 8 to 10% threshold that the average S&P 500 does over time, if you're able to hold for at least 5 or 10 years. Because these millennials who receive this $20 trillion worth of wealth, what are they going to do with all that wealth? Where are they going to put it? Are they going to leave it all in real estate? Probably leave a good chunk of it, most of it, in real estate and bonds and stocks. Maybe not bonds, but yeah, it's obviously a much more likely scenario that the millennials will put a higher percentage of their net worth than in crypto than the boomers did. And for this very long-term outlook play, like, there's only 2 real assets, maybe 3, that I would be very comfortable to hold for the next 10 or 20 years, and that's being Bitcoin and Tesla. Like, Tesla is just killing it, and they just released their new semi-truck, which is just crazy. If you want me to do a video about that, let me know. But Bitcoin is just super safe. Ethereum maybe, but Ethereum just carries that little bit of extra risk over the next decade. But Bitcoin right now is in a negative realized price, which means most people who bought Bitcoin are actually in a loss. And this rarely happens with Bitcoin, and whenever it has happened, has usually been an amazing time to buy Bitcoin. And you can add to that long-term holders are at an all-time high for Bitcoin. So long-term holders being someone who has held their Bitcoin for more than 155 days. So 13.84 million Bitcoins, and there's 19 million out at the moment. So a huge proportion of this supply of Bitcoin is in the hands of long-term holders. The reason buying when people are generally in a loss is that the incentive to sell at a loss is lower than the incentive to sell at a profit. When you're in massive profits, there is a much greater incentive to sell your Bitcoin than when you're in a massive loss. You might not want to take that loss, or you just forget about it. If it's only worth, if it was worth 1,000 and now it's only worth 50 or something, you might just I'll leave it. It's not even worth the €50. So obviously, earning a good wage, saving up your money, and buying a house was the perfect playbook to get wealthy for our parents, but I don't think it's going to work in the future. So this is how I've been positioning myself, and I'm sure I sound like a broken record, but the majority of my wealth is in Tesla, Bitcoin, Ethereum, and some NFTs. The long-term plays, the very long-term plays, Tesla and Bitcoin. And even if Tesla or Bitcoin go bust, I still think having 50% in Tesla or 50% in Bitcoin, even if one goes completely bust, I still think your returns will be better than the S&P 500 or buying a house or something like that, in my personal opinion. So that's how I'm hedged to have a good chunk of both assets. And yeah, I don't think one of them will go bust. I think over the coming decades, a lot of money will go into crypto and some disruptive stocks as well. So if you did enjoy the video, I would hugely appreciate you hit the thumbs up button, subscribe if you're new, and make sure to hit the notification bell if you actually want to see my videos. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.